Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
For centuries, Christians had no other explanation for the origin of humans than what they read in the book of Genesis. And because that was the very word of God, there was absolutely no question that, well, that's the way it happened. And then in the 19th century, our understanding began to change. We began finding Neanderthal skeletons. Darwin published his book, Origin of Species. We discovered genetics and found that our relationship to chimpanzees went so much deeper than simply having similar bodies. And ever since, the question of human origins has become a topic that has divided Christians, giving us young earth creationists versus old earthers, and shipwrecked the faith of many. Dr. Joshua Swamidass has created a lot of buzz in the Christian apologetics arena. That'll happen when a scientifically trained expert who accepts the idea of human evolution shows that it's entirely scientifically defensible to talk about all humans living today coming from one primal couple a few thousand years ago. This is the main idea in his recent book, The Genealogical Adam&Eve, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry. Dr. Swamidass has got a graduate training in biology and in information and computer sciences and a medical degree after that. And he's now an associate professor of laboratory and genomic medicine at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. So, Dr. Swamidass, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's I've been following you guys for a while, and it's great to have this conversation with you.
Our pleasure.
May I ask, are you a clinician as well these days?
So I do have a medical degree, but I ended up really falling in love with science and finding myself here. And then when I was on the interview path for residency, actually, I got offered a full-time, research faculty position at Washington University. That was about a little bit over 10 years ago. So
Wow.
I was really fortunate. That just never happens. And Wash is a top medical school, top 5 medical school. And it just was too good to be true, it seemed. So, and long story short, I ended up focusing entirely on the scientific work.
Good. Well, before we get into that hardcore science, tell us a bit about your background. What kind of a Christian tradition did you grow up in?
So I was born and raised in Southern California into a family of Indian immigrants. And we, like many immigrants actually, were young earth creationists. And it's different than you kind of see in the United States because it wasn't really driven by science, but it was probably just, so it wasn't really connected to scientific apologetics. It wasn't because of like Ken Ham or CRI or CMI. I mean, I got introduced to that later in the American context. But it was really it seemed to be like a simple face level reading of scripture taught. And we hadn't really been exposed to modern evolutionary science, at least, in a lot of immigrant communities, right? So in a lot of ways, it was kind of like a pre-scientific reading.
Okay.
A type of young earth creationism, if that makes sense. But there were things that were like so much more important for most of us than that. Now, of course, coming to the United States, it ends up being connected more and more to fundamentalism. And I was raised in that context too. So I'm an Indian American. So, I have that international component of being an immigrant, but then also I'm an American too. So I was swimming in the same water that everyone else is here too.
Okay. And then you fell in love with science. Tell us about how you got involved so closely with genetics, especially at the population level.
Well, I wanted to be a medical doctor. My mom was a medical doctor and had worked as a missionary doctor for a time in some rural parts of India. When she came here, she ended up doing a lot of work at a crisis pregnancy center that she's been doing for decades now. And I was just very drawn to that aspect of serving the world, serving the Lord through medical care. But as I kind of got farther and farther in my medical education, I realized that I was probably going to enjoy becoming a physician, but I'd probably get bored with being a physician. And, I was always just drawn to science in different ways. And then I started undergrad in 96, graduated in 2000. 2000 is the year that the first human genome was sequenced. I remember watching on TV with Bill Clinton, Craig Venter, and Francis Collins, where they were on TV and they gave their talks explaining how that major milestone was hit. I mean, I was a pre-med student, but then I found out about an MD PhD and went down that path. And at the time, there was like this nascent field called bioinformatics.
Okay.
whereas applying computational stuff to solve problems in medicine. And I mean, I've always been drawn to biology and because of medicine, and I was doing all that. But honestly, I'm kind of built more with a mathematical sort of thinking. And so I was like programming for a while. I was even considering going to an economics degree, which is very math heavy. I was really drawn. I mean, I was really good at that. But kind of torn between all these different things I was interested in, but then I found the way to kind of fit it all together by doing medical science from a computational point of view. And so that's what I've been doing really now for the last, what is it now? Like 25 years now.
Wow.
You're still young in the field. Don't.
Yeah, mid-career, right?
Yeah. So now during all of that training and that science, you were exposed to this idea of standard model of evolution, how species evolved one form into another over hundreds of millions of years, and eventually you get the hominid line and then humans. And you fully accepted that explanation for our origins, especially as you became more and more immersed in science and genetics. And you still accept that scientific explanation, I'm assuming.
Well, yeah, I affirm evolution. And I would say the key part of that's been hard for Christians is the common descent of man, is the idea that humans, we share, if you go trace our tree back far enough, there's going to be, about 6 million years ago. Well, first of all, our ancestors go back that far is one thing, right? They go back 6 million years. That answer wouldn't be human as we understand it, but that ancestor would have given rise to us, but it also would have been an ancestor of modern day chimpanzees. That idea of human evolution or common descent is something, it just really seems that that's what the evidence shows. It took me a while to come to peace with that. It wasn't really even until probably 2005 with the sequencing of the human genome. I'm sorry, not the human genome, with the chimpanzee genome, where I got to look at that closely. That was a major event for a lot of us that were kind of working through this and trying to make sense of it. I mean, the genetic evidence really could not be more clear. It really looks like common descent. I mean, God could have made it clear in our genomes that we don't descend from chimpanzees, but he didn't. He made that really look like we share a common ancestry with them.
Okay, so ironically, it was science that made you wonder about the traditional biblical story, and science also which gave you the way to accept the biblical story. And that's the main theme of your book. So tell us how you came to this new understanding of how it is possible to accept the idea that all humans today originate from a single couple, even as recently as a few thousand years ago.
That's a good question. So given, from that young earth creationist point of view, the key thing for me was scripture. And if I was to say it, I think the best aspect of young earth creationism is like a particular respect and honor for what scripture is teaching and wanting to take that seriously. And I never really was ready to abandon that for science, period. And so I was kind of in a place of tension or paradox. Mm-hmm. This is something that it's a little bit hard sometimes for fundamentalists. Maybe even it's hard for people at like either end of the spectrum, I'd say. Yeah, it's easy to kind of dismiss one side as completely illegitimate and then take the other side as correct. But I wasn't ready to do that. I wanted to see what the legitimacy was on both sides. And so you kind of come across these apparent contradictions, these things that people who are a lot smarter than you, a lot older than you, who've been doing this longer, you are convinced are places of conflict. And you don't know how to fit them together, but rather than just letting go of both sides of it, you kind of hold on to both and see what happens. And for me, as I was getting more and more trained in this, I wasn't really willing to take someone's word for it that there was conflict. I wanted to see it for myself. I mean, I was getting trained as a scientist, and I was becoming a better and better scientist. And I said, I should be able to see this for myself if there really is a conflict. And the most puzzling thing about the conversation on Adam and Eve was how convinced everyone was that it was in conflict. The idea of an Adam and Eve, ancestors of us all, de novo created, was in conflict with the evidence. And, if that was the case, okay, so we can deal with that then and try and make sense of it. But when I asked people for evidence, I could never get a straight answer. And so that just really prompted me to be thinking more deeply about it and looking more deeply on it. And everything kind of finally clicked together, I would say, in 2017. That was about 5 years ago. And it was really through understanding the science and just finding out that actually for quite some time. It's crazy to say this because normally it's not this way. You'll hear people saying that everyone else was wrong, but in this case, it's kind of what happened. everyone had just missed some really important stuff in the science. And it turns out that there isn't nearly as much conflict as people had thought.
So what is it? What was it that you found that opened your eyes to say, okay, we can hold both of those ideas that seem to be contradictory. We can hold them together.
Yeah, so there's going to be debate about how to read Genesis, but for a moment, just go with me with a very young Earth creationist sort of reading. Not in an anti-evolution sort of way, but just reading Genesis very, very literally, okay? Now, if you can take a very, very literal reading of Genesis, and swallow that whole, and it's consistent with evolution, you really have to wonder how much conflict there really is. And that's basically what happened. And by the way, this is, once again, postponing the question about whether or not this is actually the right way to read Genesis. That's a different discussion. Let's just kind of think about this from just reading it that way, okay? So even if Adam and Eve were as recent as just 6,000 years ago and lived in the Middle East, and they were de novo created, that means that created without parents miraculously in a way that's different than anyone else alive, right? Our best scientific estimates show that they would be ancestors of everyone by AD1, 2,000 years ago. And so that means that Adam and Eve could have been de novo created, entirely consistent with the genetic and archaeological evidence, as recently as 6,000 years ago in the Middle East. Of course, it could have been more ancient. And they'd be ancestors of everyone in our theological era, which is how most of the church have understood it. The only thing that evolution really presses on is something that I, as a young Earth creationist, and many young Earth creationists wonder about already, the idea about whether or not God created people outside the garden. And so then that solves the problem. There was people outside the garden that they interbred with when they exited.
Right. So just so the listeners are catching up with you, your idea then is basically that you still have evolution going on for hundreds of thousands of years, evolution of humans or of life for
Millions of years, yeah.
Yeah, millions for life, but for humans, it would be for what we would call Homo sapiens. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years and large numbers and spreading out across the continents. And then you get this de novo creation of one couple inserted into that, interbreeding with the other people around them. And it's not through genetic connections that we see all people today coming from that primal couple, but through genealogical. And that's a big, important difference. So that's really what your story is. If you can tell us what that's all
about. So it's proposing a genealogical Adam and Eve as opposed to a genetic. And part of what had been going on is part of the reason why people thought that that's impossible is because they were working from a very strongly genetic frame and thinking that most people didn't actually have a clear grasp of what even the difference was. So they would use words that are implying genetics or meanings, but I mean, they were not well differentiated concepts in people's mind, even though they really are different things. And genetics, to be clear, is a very, very bizarre way of thinking about ancestry. I mean, you have to go study a great deal about it. We've only learned about it very recently. I can tell you with 100% certainty that there's no mention of genetics in Genesis. And in any place in Scripture, because I mean, any more than we expect to see like discussion of quarks.
Right, yeah.
Or photons. I mean, that's not the language of ordinary perception. It's not, they didn't have the conceptual framework. It's not that they didn't have intelligence. They just had no conceptual framework to form words that had that semantic context of genetics, right?
Right.
Now, we've learned about genetics, and we know that there's a relationship between genetics and ancestry. But it is, like I said, it's a strange, bizarre, scientific thing. Okay. And so if we care about genealogical ancestry, you have to think about that, and you get a very different answer than if you care about genetics.
Right. As I understand your premise then, so I myself, here in 2022, I've got two parents, but my two parents each have two parents, so now we have four. That's the second generation. They have two parents, so now we're at 8. Next generation, 16, then 32, 64, 122, that sort of thing. So as I understand your mathematics, when you go back only 50 generations, I just listed, I think, 7 or 8 of them. If you go back 50 generations, you're already at something like a quadrillion people. I'm related to a quadrillion people if you go back 50 generations. But there wasn't even 50 quadrillion.
Well, that's with the naive calculation where you don't consider interbreeding. There wasn't quadrillion people, many people.
Well, that's the point, yeah, that I'm related to everybody who existed 50 generations ago, and the same people who eventually produced me, produced you, and produced Scott, and everybody else around us. We all came from those people 50 generations ago. So that's the genealogical connection that we have with our ancestors. But then the opposite happens when you talk about genetics. Each of those parents we talked about, they only give half of their DNA to their kids. Those kids only give a half of that DNA, so now a quarter, then a 16th, and it goes backwards. So that's why we can't talk about genetic connection, but we can totally talk about genealogical connections.
Yeah, so it doesn't take. I mean, so like when my children, I have like a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. They have an understanding of ancestry, but they don't talk about genetics. They talk about who their dad is and who their nana is. And
Right.
And in the case of the biblical authors, their concern really is genealogy, right? It's generations. It's
yeah,
Abraham,
they're talking about
Isaac,
who's
Jacob,
begetting
like
who. They're talking about.
That's right, right.
And it'd be a mistake to say, "Oh, that's just like metaphor," or I
Right.
mean, they're talking in a way that's concrete, right? Now, maybe it's metaphorical, but just because it's not genetics doesn't mean it's not something that's physical parentage, right?
Right.
These were statements that I think most Christians who have read Genesis, not just most Christians, but most Jewish people and most Muslims, most readers of Genesis, until maybe the recent centuries, have just understood those to be claims about the physical world. In our current moment, we just misunderstood, and we thought that would leave evidence in our genomes. And that was a mistake. That's just a scientific error. That's like thinking that 1 + 1 = 3. That's just not true. Most genealogical relationships, even just going back a few hundred years, just leave no evidence in our DNA.
Right.
So our expectation scientifically is just that there isn't going to be any, evidence of that, which might seem like a very simple claim, and it is. And if everyone had thought that from the beginning, there'd be really no importance to my work. The problem is that everyone was convinced the exact opposite, that there was an immense amount of evidence, if evolution were true, that there's a conflict with the story of Adam and Eve being ancestors of all of us. And that just turns out to be a profound and deep and pervasive misunderstanding of the science.
And it's because the one side, scientists are just thinking genetics, and the other side is thinking genealogy, a whole different definition of origins.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say it was complicated. I mean, I think one of the things that I found out, I mean, like, remember, I was in a computational biology program. I hang around with biologists all the time. Most biologists did not have straight in their heads that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
They just collapsed them together. And it's not something that's really worked out. Population genetics is a very niche area in biology that most biologists don't get deep training in. You would learn about it in population genetics, and most of them will have a good handle on it, but they also don't know much about theology for the most part, so they didn't realize the importance of that distinction. And so I think it was just a very confused conversation where there was just I think the more fundamental thing is, at least in the theological and the public conversation, these things have been conflated.
Yep, totally. And that's why they've come to opposite answers. I get that.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask this question?
Sure.
Just as a layperson and trying to follow the discussion. Are you saying that that genealogically, it's quite reasonable to expect that we came from two people, a couple? However, you aren't saying that that was the only human couple in history. In other words, there could have been other people, but the current population comes from that couple. Is that kind of what is that? Am I reading that right? Or?
Well, to be clear, I'm saying there's be people outside the garden that we descend from as well.
Right.
And I'm saying the word people because I'm trying to avoid the term human, because human is a term that isn't actually very well defined scientifically. Okay.
Okay.
And it's pretty theologically potent. And science doesn't really tell us how we're supposed to think about the term human from a theological point of view.
Right.
What we know scientifically is there's a lot of Homo sapiens out there, which is not the same thing as human. There's a lot of Homo sapiens out there that have all the same sorts of abilities that we do, and they're a lot like us, and we're all related to them too.
Okay.
Now, what do we think about that theologically is a great question, but the science doesn't give much direction beyond that.
Okay.
And so you could say, and now this is getting to theological points of view, right? Depending what you mean by human, you could say still that Adam and Eve were still the first humans on all of Earth, because that's just not the humans that when we talk about monogenesis, we mean by human. And so that's one of the cases I make. But that's not to say that people outside were not human in the way how we typically understand it, as deserving human dignity and worth, and being fully intelligent and all of that. And so I'm making a subtle distinction there. It's just there's two different discourses. It's kind of like, I mean, I was raised in two cultures in a lot of ways, Indian culture and American culture. There's just times you use words in just very profoundly different ways, even though it's the same utterance, it's the same syllables or sound that's there. They have a different referent. And I think that's a big part of what the conflict has been, is that people have really just collapsed once again, not just genetics and genealogy with ancestry, and they're very different things, but also this idea of human, and collapse the very different ways of people can mean human all into a single discourse of human, where, maybe they're meaning different things when you say it.
Okay.
And part of the answer, I think, you correct me, Josh. The part of the answer is that there would have been other lineages other than this one couple. So let's call it the Adamic lineage, Adam and Eve,
Yeah.
and then the other lineages that were going on at the time. But those would become intertwined as they interbred, intermarried, and so although there's lots of different lineages, they begin to become part of the same thing, this Adamic lineage.
Yeah, that's right. So in the past, so in a different theological era, long before the doctrine of monogenesis has been formed, long before, Paul writes Romans, there would have been an Adamic lineage that all descend from Adam and Eve, and others, and there'd be others outside that don't descend from Adam and Eve yet.
Okay.
And you can see hints of that in Genesis. People have been wondering for a long time about things like, where did Cain get his wife?
Yeah.
And this is just kind of drawing on that part of the Genesis tradition and saying, well, maybe he got his wife from like the surrounding people, that God had created another way. They're not the focus of Genesis. That's why they just appear in the peripheral vision. And then these two worlds end up kind of colliding and intertwining and becoming the same one. So now, in our era, over the last 2,000 years, we all do descend from Adam and Eve. And so that aspect of the tradition ends up being correct.
But now coming back to what you were saying, that there would have been a time when those other lineages for a while were outside of the Adamic one. It took time for these lines to intermingle, right? It took time for people to migrate from, this Adam and Eve in the Middle East. They had to somehow, their line had to somehow migrate to other parts of the world before those lineages could intertwine. So you've got the kids and the grandkids and some number of generations of these people in other parts of the world. I'm thinking the Americas, the far end of Asia, Australia and Tasmania, that sort of thing. For a long time, they would have been outside of this Adamic lineage. And then what does that do, since we're talking about theology and some of the theology that's based on this whole Adamic lineage idea, those people would have been outside of the Adamic lineage. What does that do for them?
Well, it raises lots of questions. And the thing about it is that these aren't new questions. I would say the place where most of these questions arose in the most poignant way at first was considering the reality that when Columbus discovered India or the Americas, that there were people living here.
Yeah.
And that was 500 years ago. So it raised all these grand theological questions about what to do with all these people that have been living around for 1,500 years after Jesus lived.
Right.
Like, are they fully human? Do they descend from Adam? Do they have equal rights and dignity? Those are all the sorts of questions that arose. And that's actually the context in which the doctrine of monogenesis becomes most clear. But it didn't get clear by answering all the questions. It just became open questions that people didn't really know. And there's been a large range within historical Christianity, different ways of thinking about it.
Right.
So in this context, in some ways, it's a lot easier because we're not dealing with this large group of people that exists now that we have to figure out what to deal with. That would be a very pressing, challenging issue. This is more similar to the question of, what to make theologically of Neanderthals, right? Of course, or more recently, a Homo sapien living 10,000 years ago. Well, I'd say there's a couple things that guide us if we think that Adam and Eve are recent. I think I know not everyone who listens to the podcast is a Christian. I mean, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to take that just as an assumption. I would say that, I know God created them. I mean, he created them through a process of common descent, but he created them too. And I think that God cares about them and he's going to do something fair with them. But what that is, I don't know. I mean, maybe he walked with some of them like he walked with Enoch. Maybe they don't go to hell, but they go to oblivion. They just kind of don't come back when they die. Or maybe there was some other dispensation of grace. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of opportunities and possibilities that are consistent with the faith, but God didn't tell us, so we can't really know.
Now, Josh, you began talking about this idea. You right away introduced the idea of divine intervention in the sense that you talked about an Adam and Eve created de novo in the garden within the context of this larger other human population that came about, over hundreds of thousands of years through evolution. So you brought up this idea of divine intervention, but there's another aspect in which I wonder we need to talk about divine intervention being necessary here. We were saying how not all the lineages would have necessarily survived. I think you made that comment that, if we go back to the time of Abraham and Sarah, there are lots of couples, lots of lineages that were starting at that point in time. And there's no guarantee that any one of them was going to survive thousands of years to the present day. Any couple at that time didn't have a guarantee that their lineage was going to survive for thousands of years. It was quite a long shot. And here's why.
Oh, no, it's not a long shot. Actually, most people that produced grandkids, their lineage would survive. That's how the
Well,
math
but that's
works. So it's
the
actually
thing,
not a
though.
long shot at all. It's a
Yeah, but
very
that's the thing, though.
likely
Not
thing.
not all couples have kids, and then those that did have kids and grandkids, not all the grandkids would produce children.
Sure, yeah.
So that's what I'm saying, that not all the lineages were going to survive. And maybe I shouldn't say it's a long shot, but you can't. It's not a guarantee. And this is where I'm going with this point. It becomes really interesting that one particular family line, the one that includes Abraham and Sarah, and all of their descendants, that lineage at the same time, back then, thousands of years ago, they were writing down a long string of prophecies and promises of exactly that they were going to become central in human history. They were writing this down thousands of years before it became a reality. And it's not like
Yeah.
lots of lineages at that time were doing that. I think this is something that was unique to the Semitic Abrahamic line. And then here's my point. It's either an incredible coincidence that those people were writing those prophecies and they did make it to the present day, that they saw this coming, or now again you have to bring in this idea of divine intervention to make that happen.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that is a puzzle, right? There is strange stuff about the Jewish literature at that time, right? About what's in, quote unquote, the Old Testament, as we might say as a Christian, right? It does kind of have this universal direction to it that is that is a little bit strange compared to most other literature out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the whole idea of, it seems in the Old Testament, of Abraham is that God is going to, in a sense, bless and rescue his creation through one family, through one lineage, which will eventually result. I mean, when you think about the importance of genealogies in the New Testament, you can see that this is still front and center in the thinking of the first century, of the writers of the Gospels.
Yeah, I mean, and even if you go back just 2,000 years ago, like Israel is a colony of the Roman Empire, right? This isn't like it's an emperor who has been conquering a vast area that, has designs to conquer the world. That's not what was going on. These are a tiny little tribe that seems to be convinced that they're going to have an impact on the entire cosmos. It's strange, actually. And there's really no evidence in contrast with, for example, Rome or the Greek Empire or things like that. There's no actual evidence that they're relying on that they're going to be
Right.
having that sort of impact. That's not there.
Yeah.
So it's strange. And
to my point, then, I'm not saying that because we can read this in the Bible, therefore it must have happened. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that those people thousands of years ago were saying it was going to happen, and we don't have evidence of other family lines doing that. That just wasn't a thing that was happening. But these guys had the audacity to write this down, and look at it now.
That is fascinating. Yeah, there's
it's puzzling, like I said.
Yeah, there's a great book by Thomas Cahill. I don't know if you've read any of his books, but yeah, he's a historian, and he wrote a book called The Gifts of the Jews. And I've always loved the subtitle, How a Bunch of Desert Nomads Changed the Way We All Think and Feel. And I thought, boy, that kind of nails it, like a bunch of desert nomads. And you think of the outsized influence that those desert nomads had on the modern world. It is quite astonishing. No matter what explanation, whether you're an atheist and say, well, that just happened by chance or whatever, but no matter what you say, it is astonishing.
So, Josh, I do have a concern, and I'm asking this because I'm really keenly interested to see how you deal with this. One of my concerns is just how this feeds, this idea, this evidence, it feeds into a certain theological narrative held by two very different Christian camps. So on the one hand, obviously the young earth creationists are probably cheering that now we have scientific evidence of Adam and Eve. And on the other hand, you've got more liberal believers who are okay with an ancient universe and biological evolution, but they nonetheless agree with the young earth creationists in insisting on a unique primal pair that de novo created Adam and Eve that you talked about. And in both cases, whether these liberal believers or the young earth creationists, they're doing this for theological reasons. And here's where my concern then is. Both groups interpret Genesis 3 as explaining the origin of sin, that whole original sin that's, passed down through the family tree. And that justifies the idea that we're all fallen and need redemption. And then that in turn gets wrapped up in the whole penal substitution idea and the divine bloodshed around that. All of these hinge on the idea that we humans need to have come from a single primal couple. And so even though I can see where you're going with the math and it makes sense, and I can see where you logic your way through this, it does make sense. I'm uncomfortable with how this bolsters that kind of theology. I'm just concerned with how it is used by those two camps.
Well, my first answer to that might sound like a cop-out, but I think it's very, very true. And we can talk about the next part. So I'll give more than one answer. The first is that, the reason why we should do it is it's just because it's true. We should tell people because it's true. We shouldn't tell them we have evidence against their theological position when we don't. And there's something intrinsically good about getting the science straight and explaining to people, especially when it's people that we disagree with theologically, that the science actually makes space for them. So on that base level, that's actually probably like the base level of ethics where even atheists have really kind of joined in and jumped in to really have. It's not because they agree with these types of beliefs, but because there's something like intrinsically good about making space for theological disagreements with good science, and that's right. I think that's my first answer. So whatever my personal beliefs are, or whatever the theological things, I think that's maybe like the secular starting place that I'd want to begin with.
Okay. No.
But there's more to this, right? Because there's the theological questions about, okay, if it's possible, should we even think about these things, right?
Yeah. But now you began your answer there with saying, well, if it's true, we just want to be honest and we want to present it essentially, right?
Well, yeah, but there's an ambiguous pronoun of what is the it. The it is I'm talking about is that the beliefs that they think are important are not actually in conflict with the scientific evidence. Yeah. That's true.
But where I'm going with this, because I want to push back a little bit on that. You essentially were saying that even though we don't want them to be able to have this information because they can take it down the wrong path, it's still true, and we should just be open and honest with what we've discovered, what we've learned. And so then my pushback is this. I tried to think of other examples where the world, the community, has had to wrestle with this question. I do remember during the COVID era, somebody was asking me, what about this scientific paper that shows that a vaccine can in fact make small changes to your DNA? And of course, the first response I went was, well, no, that's obviously a piece of garbage. But when I looked at it, it was a reputable paper that did look into this COVID vaccine, and there was some small changes. They were very small. They were not significant, not the kind that the anti-vaxxers were squawking about. But the point is this, I really felt that paper was really kind of being carefully suppressed because it would feed into the anti-vaxxer rhetoric. Another example, I thought of three, and here's another one. The CRISPR technology. The scientists can tell you can do this in your garage. You can do CRISPR genetic mutations in your garage, but they don't want to tell people that because they could really mess up the world. Same thing with nuclear bombs. And the third example I thought of was investors. They wouldn't, even though they know you can make a lot of money on short selling and derivatives and that kind of thing, they really don't want to tell your average investor because you can really make a lot of mistakes with that. And so those are three examples where, okay, it is the truth, but we kind of keep it on the down low because people can abuse it.
Yeah, I would say that there's very clear harm that can be done by certain types of information that you can put out there. I don't think that applies in this situation. I would even say, like in the COVID vaccine example you gave, I'd say that really needs to be public. That's part of how we build trust as the scientific community, not by oversimplifying and banning certain types of good studies, but by actually directly engaging them. So that's a different thing than making clear how to do CRISPR at home. There can be real harm that can come from that, right?
Right.
So I think that's important. But I go beyond this. The people who've kind of probably taken that view the most have been Christians that have liberal theology that are really uncomfortable with an Adam and Eve. What's interesting, though, is that has not been the most common response from atheist scientists and educators. The vast majority of them immediately see the immense public good that would come from religious communities understanding that there's not conflict between evolution and their deeply held religious beliefs, even though these atheists are convinced those religious beliefs are just flat out wrong.
Right.
And so there's just so many goods that come from this. It diffuses so much conflict that it's only really, I think the only way to understand that is that, I think a lot of times there's like an in-house theological debate between liberal Christians and conservative Christians that seems to be really important, but I don't think it's that important in the grand scheme of things. I think that there's things that are far more important than that. And so I'm okay with even fundamentalists getting the upper hand with good science. I mean, frankly, it would be great if instead of having bad theology and bad science, they had bad theology and good science.
Yeah,
They were
that'd be a
promoting.
step
Then we could
forward.
actually
Yeah.
talk about the theological stuff. And I don't think it's like a power issue too. Like, I mean, one of the reasons why I have a hard time with American fundamentalism is how they abuse power.
Right. Totally.
And there's power in politics that we're all aware of and how that gets abused, but there's also power in science. And one profound abuse of power in science that I've seen in the conversation is where people claim that mainstream science supports their theological position and damages the other person's theological position where it's not true. And that's an abuse of power. And even if I think someone is wrong theologically, I'm not comfortable doing that personally, and I'm not comfortable with other people using science that way.
Years ago, I'll never forget watching a debate at the University of Western Ontario between Philip Rushton, a scientist who was proposing some very controversial racial ideas, and Dr. Suzuki, a very popular Canadian scientist who's an environmentalist, has written, very astute guy. And I'll never forget at a certain point in that conversation, because Rushton kept saying, look, I'm here to debate the facts. I'm here to debate the science. Show me where I have erred in my analysis, and I will be happy to, revise my conclusions and so on. But that's what I want to do. Suzuki, in response to that, said, you know what? Even if the science is right, we should not go there. And I thought back to Galileo. He was turning over the whole Aristotelian understanding of the universe at his time. That's the real threat that he was. It wasn't so much theological. And the church basically said, doesn't matter what you see, we're not going there. It's too radical, it's too upsetting. And it really it really concerns me that we would ever do that, because science is supposed to be not that. Science is supposed to be damn the consequences. This is reality. This is the truth. Now you figure out how you're going to deal with that truth, but we don't referee that.
Well, there is going to be referees. So we don't want the Tuskegee experiments to happen. So there are going to be ethical boundaries, and they have to be negotiated.
Sure.
But yeah, when it comes to knowledge, I think that I think that we're supposed to really be driven by, what the evidence shows, and and to be clear, I think that is how science works. So I think Suzuki in that case would have been wrong, and I think that actually ended up benefiting Rushton. Rushton put forward a lot of racist theories that were wrong on the evidence that had major scientific points of things, and to come at him and say we just shouldn't go there, even if what you're saying is true, that actually makes it sound like these people who are kind of motivated by politics and aren't actually thinking about it, and I think that's very dangerous. And I don't. And I want to tell you that's a great example of what I've seen so much happen in this conversation, where people don't want to actually hear and listen and get a good, accurate account of the science because they disagree with the theological position behind it. And I don't think that that's right. I don't think it's good science. I don't think it's fundamentally honest. And I think that's part of what has led to many of the fractures we see in the conversation. I think what we need to be trustworthy people that people can trust us to be truthful about where science engages with their beliefs, even if we strongly disagree with those beliefs. And so that's like a sacred thing to me. I mean, it's a sacred thing to many scientists. I'm not the only scientist who sees it that way, but that's a sacred thing to me, because I understand that I've spent decades now studying science. I'm a scientist. I have special expertise here. And there's nuanced things that, like, I have the ability to go research and find out and understand, or maybe I already do understand, that are just very hard to understand if you're not an expert. And it's very easy to kind of mislead the public about things. We've seen that over and over again in the science, right? For me, I want to be a trustworthy voice where, even if it's something that ultimately undermines my position theologically or otherwise, I want to be truthful to the public about science. And that's so deep to the core of what I've done here in this, that even if it led to very racist theology, what I'm doing, which it doesn't, even if it did all that, I still think it's important to be truthful about this. And I think, as a ethical human being, I'd want to, and I have also engaged the other side of it too, to make sure to limit its damage. But it shouldn't be by suppressing the truth. It should be by actually engaging these things in a more ethical way. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but I still do push back. I agree with most of the things that you both have said, but here's where I am very uncomfortable with giving the young Earth creationists in this case, or the people who want to say that we have to have had a primal couple. Now they can say, great, we've got scientific evidence that we're right, that primal couple, because that theology so often eventually is tied up with things like the whole penal substitution and going to hell theology.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of like a guilty by association thing. So one thing that's happened through this, I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of these Christians, and the ones that are a lot more informed, and I found out that a lot of these issues are a lot more nuanced.
They're totally nuanced, yeah.
Yeah, so even you talk about like original sin, there's many different conceptions of it, and I have to say, one of the weirder things I've seen in this is how I can expand on this if you'd like, especially being here as a scientist living in St. Louis. This is like a very present thing. I mean, on one hand, you have very conservative Christians talking about how original sin from Adam and Eve is very real and the world is fallen. On the other hand, you have very liberal Christians who think that that's nonsense, but at the same token are very committed to the idea of like systemic injustice and generational impacts over time. And I'm kind of like, aren't these kind of like the same idea? And I think there really is a connection there that that I think there are ways to understand this can actually make more sense of the world. And I think actually the notion that the world has fallen and that there was a better way it could have been, like and that there's a generation after generation impact of our parents' sins upon us in a way that we can't escape, is I think it's such a profoundly true thing that even liberal people, I think, like I said, end up adopting it just with different labels. And I think there might be a better way to think about this that kind of reconnects these kind of frayed bonds.
And that better way is nuanced. But the reason I'm concerned about this, and it's not just that they have a different theology and I want them to have mine, that's not it. I see so much damage rooted in both of those concepts, the penal substitution and the whole hell theology, leads to all kinds of spiritual abuse. So that's why I'm so animated about this. I just think giving those people scientific evidence that, yep, they're right, it just emboldens them.
Well, no, I didn't say that, yes, you're right about penal substitution. What I said is that what you're believing can be consistent with the scientific evidence. That is not saying you were right about everything. And I think I don't know anyone who thinks that I'm saying that you're just right carte blanche like that.
I'm not saying that. I apologize if you took it that way.
My concern...
But what I think is going on, though, is there's an opportunity for a conversation for you to address that, Luke. So I think what's prevented the conversation is that the science ended up being a showstopper to that question. I think what I found is so I think there's something different going on than I think most people understand among more conservative Christians. It's not what I've observed. I'm talking about a very large swath. Okay. It's not like a narrow commitment to a very rigid belief system that's driving most of them. What it is, I would say, is it's a type of traditionalism, ironically, where they're committed to really being aligned with historical Christianity. And at the same time, they're generally ignorant of historical Christianity.
Right.
But it's kind of like they know that bucket of historical Christianity is what they want to be aligned with, and they're resisting things that seem to be kind of going away from that. And so the way to really, I think, make progress on this is to actually have conversation about what actually the Christian tradition has been on these things. Right. And to start educating and thinking about it, to see what the range of that tradition has been, which is a lot broader than most people. I mean, like most American evangelicals, for example, are not aware that annihilationism has been like a long part of the Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. And that even John Stott was an annihilationist, was very open to it. And that's not like a heresy to wonder about eternal conscious torment. That's not actually a heresy. It's actually something that we're invited to wonder about and to think about. And, there's more like this. And I think what we're going to find out is that as we get more acquainted with the Christian tradition, there's an opportunity for better conversations. Not that we're all going to change our views, but maybe we will all have a bit more tolerance for one another and maybe a bit more refinement in our thinking.
I'd welcome that.
I think one of the challenges with, I mean, this is like, recovering evangelicals. So some of us are are kind of exiting evangelicalism, defined in the American context. I think that's what it's meant. One option actually for those of us that are leaving it is to kind of enter, international evangelicalism, which is a much better place. It's kind of where I kind of find my home too, right? But some people are in a whole range of places. I get that, but here's the thing, we should all be kind of engaging with one another and learning from one another and figuring out this stuff together. I think there's something profoundly good, though, in my view. I mean, I would put myself as a traditionalist this way. I'm not a scholar. I don't always know church history, but if this is going to make sense, I want to find a way to make sense of all of it, in a way that's most aligned with historical Christianity.
Right.
And I'm going to be most amenable to the arguments that show continuity with the historical Christian faith rather than some grand revision of it. And what I found actually is because I'm doing it from that point of view, there's been a large number of very conservative Christian theological places that have welcomed me with open arms, even though I affirm evolution.
Yeah.
Right.
Because this has been, once again, very surprising for people, but I think it's very true, because I don't actually think that the issue is penal substitution per se, or eternal conscious torment per se, or evolution per se. It is really, I think the more fundamental thing that's really driving this is like a traditionalism versus a revisionism. And if you can present and work out a meaningful, studied recovery of historical Christianity, a lot of conservative, very theologically conservative places are very, very rewarding of that sort of approach.
Yeah, you're singing our song.
Yeah, the thing too is that I'm thinking if some of the ID people or some of the younger creationists happen to come across this discussion and they hear you saying, Luke, we shouldn't do this because it's going to give them, fodder, that is going to so strengthen their idea that there's a conspiracy in science to not tell the truth when it contradicts, a certain naturalism. And so when I was in seminary, and it was a conservative school, I won't say fundamentalist, it wasn't culturally fundamentalist, but it was very conservative theologically. We had a medical student there. And I remember him saying in class one time that in one of his biology classes, they were talking about various, genetic things or whatever. And I don't know what the particular thing was, but basically he said, the professor said, but don't tell the evangelicals that. And I remember at the time that really bolstered my idea that, boy, the scientific community is out to get us. They're hiding things, and it actually bolstered my fundamentalism, which wasn't a good thing, right? So that
in a know-nothing sort of way, because it's not like it's just more like I can't trust those people, but that's because they were acting in an untrustworthy way. People aren't going to trust us if we act in untrustworthy ways.
Yeah.
And I think that is a fundamental issue, and I'd say there's a pretty pressing issue because I'll tell you, in these communities, there's growing awareness that that Christians aligned with evolution have really misrepresented the evidence in the past. And most of the time, to be clear, it was good faith. But it still continues on now in ways that are not good faith.
Right.
And it's an experience kind of like what you're talking about, where people, look and they listen and they wonder, like, are you even aware of how much things have changed? Are you hiding it? Why? I mean, we can have a conversation about Adam and Eve, but it's only going to happen on a level playing field now.
Right.
And so I would say that, especially if you doubt who Adam and Eve is, if you want to have credibility in these spaces, you should be leading by explaining how, hey, this can make sense scientifically. I get that. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, read this and you can kind of come to terms with evolution. Maybe you're going to affirm evolution in a different way than I do. But I don't understand, you can say, why is it that Adam and Eve is so important to you? And when you talk about original sin, what do you mean by that?
Exactly.
And this is my concern. Have that conversation after having kind of taken away the big the big club of science off the table, and you'll do great good in society, because at that point it's reframing this as what it actually is. It's not a conflict between science and faith. It is rather an important discussion about theology. Yeah. Where there needs to be a lot more understanding across both sides, and probably movement on both sides too.
Right. Now, we may be going in circles here, but we have done episodes where we did address things like what really is original sin? What's a different way to understand original sin from even a scientific perspective? A whole new way to understand atonement, all these different things. Check out episodes 17, 18, 19, and 20. And I just find that there are people who come back and say, yeah, but all of that means that there wasn't a primal couple, and we need a primal couple because you have to pass sin down through the line, and and then the ball starts rolling from there. That's the concern.
Okay.
Well, so one of the first things to keep in mind when you look at the historical tradition, once again, original sin, is that there are a couple narrow points that were canonized in parts of the church, in large parts of the church. But a lot of things are unclear. Like, in no place was there any canonization of the idea that original sin transmits by DNA. No one thought that. Okay. People make a big deal about how Augustine was wrong about the transmission, but his idea of how it was transmitted was never canonized, about, only being through the homunculus, through sperm and the male line. That was never canonized. And so there's been an immense amount of debate about what original sin is and how it transmits and why it's important.
Yeah.
And parts of that have been considered heretical, but large parts of it have not been considered heretical. And so I think what's been going on is more of a situation where large parts of the church have kind of said, well, there's this idea of a historical fall is important, and somehow Adam's sin impacts us all. And that's a fairly, I would say that's basically mere Christianity there. That's what C.S. Lewis talks about. People have been willing to compromise in lots of ways that just turn out not to be necessary on that, and to say it didn't have to necessarily be a single couple. So you could say it's a population, fine, but you don't need to do that because the science, as I've shown. But the basic idea that there's something that happened by our distant ancestors that impacts us in a way that we have to be told about. We don't even know how it impacts us, and we can't fully escape it. It's the basic idea of original sin. You see that in the Western church, you see that in the Eastern church, and it's only extremely recently where you see any departure of that. It's similar to young earth creationism in that way. I mean, it's really within the last few generations that Christians have even considered options beyond that. So it really is a revision to get rid of original sin in that very, very basic level. And I'd even say it's so basic, it's something that most of us know is true anyways. Like a lot of the pieces there, we know that that what our ancestors did have a defining impact on who we are in ways that we can trace when we're talking about our parents on us. But very quickly, it becomes untraceable what those impacts are. Yet they're very determinative in ways that we can't escape. And
even biologists talk about how reptilian we are, right? That even our biology, there's a lot. The fact that we came through, a process of evolution has left
marks.
A lot of things. Has left marks, right? So our drive for survival, our drive to run from danger, all these kind of things, we have had as humans to learn to, in a certain sense, tame them, rise above them, whatever you want to call it. And you could call that original sin. I mean, you could,
I do.
You do.
So,
exactly.
but the original sin we've talked about, it's important. It has to do not just with original sin, but the idea of the goodness of creation. So part of what's going on with the fall, and this is stuff I explain in depth in my book, and I think there's a lot of nuance among conservative theological thinkers. So the stuff I'm telling you here is not a problem for them too, like the type of nuance. So the idea of talking about the goodness of creation, or potential of other falls in the past before Adam and Eve, or that's all kind of within the realm. But talking about God of creating on his own a world in which sin was baked in from the beginning, now that starts to becoming a pretty major change. And that kind of cuts to the core of a lot of theology that people have a problem with. So I don't think, talking about, for example, that type of base instinct stuff as original sin, now maybe it is in some sense, but it's not the original sin that theologians have thought is really important.
Right.
It's the idea of something that kind of enters in extrinsic from the good created order that God
right.
That kind of gets put in.
I just want to go on the record. We talked about sin in a number of different ways. I mean, you've talked about it in a way. The analogy would be it's a stain on us, and that stain gets inherited. You talked about just a second ago, you mentioned about suggesting that God created a world where sin was baked in, and you're getting at the idea that baked into the recipe was this thing that does bad things and creates a stain. I just see original sin and sin as a whole different, in a whole different way. That whole idea that sin is falling short of the intended goal. That's what the word, the original Greek and Hebrew.
Well, there's
words.
many words for sin, right? So there's falling short, which is one way Romans talks about it, which I think, I don't think that is necessarily a problem to say existed before Adam and Eve. The bigger issue is, because there's a lot of, he uses the word hamartia or hamartia or sin in different ways. Another way it's meant is transgression, how it's sometimes translated, which is the idea of crossing a line, crossing a boundary. So you can fall short without transgressing.
Right. And
so I think that transgression aspect of sin requires someone who's actually set a line down. And so I think that's
where I was going to go with this. Paul, speaking as a Jew who received received the law from a Yahweh, there was a line drawn, and then the Jewish people did cross that line. But that's not something that a lot of people who have never heard this law, they can't relate to that, and people who lived in another part of the world, they can't relate to that. But this concept of falling short of the goal being to be good and loving and helpful. Every being on earth that's ever existed has fallen short of being fully loving and giving and that sort of thing. So to me, that's where I see
possibly, but you could even frame it in a slightly different way of saying, have any of us acted so well that we deserve heaven from God? Have we fallen short of that standard?
Sorry to interrupt, but Josh. So again, we just did do that episode on hell.
Yeah, sorry about that. We're good.
To say that most of us have done something that deserves an eternal punishment or even just complete annihilation, I can't go there either. So, but anyhow, we've gotten really far off the path. Is there more things that you'd like to talk about in your book, this genealogical Adam and Eve? I know one last question that I had was this whole idea, you referred to it earlier, the definition of human. I came across a paper not so long ago that said that we now know of 21 different species of hominids or humans, 21 different species of humans. So what are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, that's even going to be debated. There's people who argue there's only one species of human, but they'll disagree on what that species is. So, I mean, science doesn't tell us what human is, right? And so, I mean, I think there's a great conversation to be had about what's happening in that debate. What is the evidence that's kind of pushing people different ways and the factors? And I think there's a really rich conversation to be had if we kind of accept that, human is a multivalent term, that everyone's kind of using it in very nuanced and different ways. And that doesn't make it muddy necessarily if we kind of sit down and really try and understand each other and what we mean.
Right.
And how it's being used. I think there's a very rich, deep conversation to be had there. And I think we're getting a taste of that here. It is far afield, but I think that's the beauty of what happened in my work, my book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, is that it just ends up being like the springboard for lots of these conversations that can be really had in a better way. So instead of kind of talking about, we know that you're wrong because science is against you, we can now start to be asking, well, what is the right way to think about original sin? What do you actually mean by it? And does that actually make sense? And how much of this is just your particularism and how much of this is actually the Christian tradition? And I think those are really good conversations. They're fun, and they do good in society. They kind of rebind ties, and in a way that kind of bridges across fractures. And I think that's actually what the goal of my book is to do in many ways, is to kind of create an opportunity for bridges to be built and a new narrative for us to kind of find together. And that ranges from things like talking about original sin and the fate of the unsaved and all these sorts of things, but also one of the things you asked me kind of other things that are really relevant are these questions of race. One of the things that I learned as I was working on this book is how deeply connected race is to origins, and my work has really connected a lot with audiences that frankly have a hard time talking about race too. So let's have these conversations together.
I think one of the criticisms of your work, it's a concern of mine at least, is that it kind of is most useful or feeds mostly into a concordist understanding of Scripture. In other words, we're trying to make Genesis scientific. And I certainly don't hold that view, because I believe the writers of Genesis lived in the Mesopotamian world and understood science, as that world understood it, right? So I don't expect anything scientific from Genesis. I think it serves a different purpose. So Is that the case, or
I think
is it
anyone
really
who
not?
says that is kind of confused on what I'm actually saying here. I'm actually taking a non-concordist view, is that science is not telling us about genetics, and it's not telling us about the origin. It's not, when it uses the word human, it's not talking about Homo sapiens or any sort of scientific concept. So, ironically, it's been a lot of non-concordists who have read Genesis in that concordist sort of way. So,
Right. Okay.
and
No, I'm
they
glad
said,
you
well, yeah, well,
clarified that.
Genesis is telling us about genetics and the origin of Homo sapiens, and we know that science just shows that's wrong. So we need to take it. I mean,
Right.
which is bizarre, but who would think?
Yeah.
Who in their right mind would think that Genesis is talking about Homo sapiens and genetics? I mean, knowing what the difference is. I mean, I understand why people who are just wrong-headed would think that in our context, but there's no way people were thinking that in the past.
Right.
And that isn't to say that it wasn't. It's all metaphorical. I think it's actually a pretty big mistake that purported non-concordists make. I think they're taking too much of a modernist view of Genesis that once again rises very recently with higher criticism in the last 150 years.
Hmm.
Extremely recently. It's kind of like a weird blip in history. But almost every reader of Genesis understood it to be talking about, the physical world in some sense. Not, I mean, there was metaphor, there was mythological elements that could be expanded on, but they did not understand it as an entirely fictional account or an entirely metaphorical account. That idea is extremely recent.
Right.
And so I'm very comfortable reading it in the way that's more ancient, to say that it's talking about reality and with language that can that is mythological at times, but there's it's talking about the physical world that we all inhabit. It's talking about real things in ways that sometimes we misunderstand, and sometimes
Right.
it's expanded
Right.
upon in legendary ways. Like, that's all fine, but there's some sort of historical core to it. That's how I
Right.
think.
Right.
That's how it's. Once again, I'd say that's how the vast majority of readers have read it until 150 years ago with higher criticism. And so, in the same way, I mean, I question young Earth creationism on the same grounds. I mean, the vast majority of Genesis readers were not slavishly committed to young Earth creationism, even if that's what they thought. And moreover, they certainly didn't have a scientific view of it. They didn't have flood geology and all of that, right?
Right. Right.
And it's only really in the 1960s that becomes common among fundamentalism. But the only time
Yeah.
people really start to think that way is with flood geology about 150 years ago. I mean, it's a very bizarre blip in Christian theology and thinking. And so on that grounds alone is enough for me to reject it.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's why I have a hard time with the purely mythological point of view. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. I mean, I understand why people did it. It's because they thought that the science conflicted.
Right.
I get that. And maybe that's what
Right.
we need to do, but that's not what the science shows. So why would we make such an ad hoc revision to the Christian faith? I don't understand.
Right.
When you say it for the longest time, it was not seen as purely mythological. Did I hear you saying that right? That people did not read the way Genesis described things as they were created and not think, okay, that was in their version of science, that was their scientific explanation of the origin of things.
Well, no, science is a very particular thing. You can say it's a time of physical reality, but that's not scientific. So, I mean, I can tell you about, my grandparents lived in India. That's not a scientific statement, but it is a statement about physical reality that we all share. So, so science talks about physical reality, but it's not the only thing that talks about physical reality.
No, I get that.
So I can say it's not science, modern science in any way, but that doesn't mean it's not talking about a physical garden or actually the literal de novo creation. I mean, like, that's how most people have read this. And I think, I mean, maybe if science really showed us that was false, we should change it. And that's what people did, over the last 150 years, right? But that was also based on a lot of really profound misunderstandings of the science. And so once again, I told you I'm a bit of a traditionalist, that I want to do something that's not defined by a current modern context, that takes science seriously, but it's also continuous with the historical faith. And that's not going to be a mythological reading of Genesis. Well, 100% mythological reading, I would say.
Yeah. Right. Right. In other words, Genesis is not Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Right. It's not a fantasy. Like you said, there's a historical thread in there. This is about us. This is about where we came from.
and
This
it's
is
talking about something that happened in our primordial past.
Yeah, right.
That's that we wouldn't know unless we heard the story. But yet it still had an impact on us. Like,
So let me just ask then, to the extent that it says, day one, this, day two, then that, day three, then that, day four, are we still saying, well, it was that? There's some historical truth to that. We don't have to read it too literally, but whatever happened on day 4 happened after whatever's described in day 3. Is that what?
I mean,
'Cause I
so
really push
there's a
back
lot of
on it.
ways to read Genesis. Genesis 1 has never really been the sticking point. It's always been Genesis 2 and 3. We can talk about Genesis 1 if you want, but there's many ways in the church tradition to draw upon to read that. I mean, very early on, having nothing to do with science, the church fathers had a whole wide range of views of how to understand those days. Augustine, there's like the framework view. I mean, there's a long story on that. So I think just on face value, it's hard to read Genesis 1 as demanding.
But sorry to interrupt, but my question is not so much do we take the days as 24-hour periods, but rather whatever was referred to on day 4 happened after whatever was referred to on day 3.
Well, there's different ways to read it. So, I mean, I like the more multivalent sort of approach to it. So I would say it's, so a lot of people, I mean, I found out that this is actually a way that's kind of been talked about. It's called the Proclamation Day view, which I think actually makes a lot of sense to me, which is idea. It's kind of, you could think about it in a temple inauguration view. It's not like it's an either or sort of reading, but it's kind of like saying, in the first day he told me about this. It's like the first day. So he's telling the story over the course of 6 days. What happened? It's 6 literal days. He's sitting telling Adam or whoever the author is, the story of what happened. So on the first day, this is what happened, and on the second day, this is what happened. But it's referent to really long periods, and it's not being spoken with scientific precision.
Right.
So it's kind of like a both and thing going on there, where it really is talking about 24 or like ordinary days, but those ordinary days are referent to larger periods. And it really is talking about God created all things in an orderly process, but it's not trying to tell us like the details. That'd be a mistaken sort of reading. So, I mean, that type of Proclamation Day view, I think makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, to me, I've always thought that if you're not speaking scientifically, you can't be wrong scientifically.
Yes,
right.
I agree with you.
But
that's why I'm not a concordist, where I'm not trying to line it up that way. I'm just what I've
Right.
done is more shown from science is that what science is saying is something different than what genetics is saying.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't think you guys are hearing me because to say that if it's not speaking scientifically, we don't have to take it scientifically. And then Josh, you leapt on that. But so what does it mean to say you speak scientifically when the text says on day 3 this is what happened, and then day 3 was done, and day 4 this happened, and day 4 was done, then day 5 this happened. I think they were speaking scientifically, their science. They believe that what happened on day 4 happened after day 3. We don't have to get into the 24-hour aspect of it. But when you look at the order of how animals appeared on Earth, it's not in that order of day 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's just not.
But I would just say there's two things about that. One, is it even really talking about eons or not? That's one big question.
No, you're again focusing on the time, whether it's 24 hours or millions of years. That's not what I'm saying. So let me then put the cards on the table. It talks about how first you had the plants were first created and they moved out on the land and your trees and things. Then it talks about the creation of the sky animals and the water animals. And then it talks about on the next day the land animals. But the truth is that what first appeared, what science tells us, is that in the water you had plants and animals evolving. Some of those then crawled out on the land, and then some of those went back into the water, and some of those went up in the sky. So the sky animals are after the creation of the land animals, not before. And they came from the creation of the water animals, but that came before the creation of the land plants. So the order is all messed up if we're going to be that concordist about Genesis.
Well, I would say it's a mistake to be concordist about Genesis. So I would
exactly.
But that's not what the best of the I mean, that's not how conservative theologians read Genesis. That's just not how it's done. Like, there's a sense that it doesn't speak with scientific precision. And then also I would add in too is that there's an assumption underlying what you're saying, that it's talking about the planet Earth and not just that local area at that time. So it could have just been talking about, because like Eretz doesn't mean globe of the earth. It just means the land. It could have been talking very locally using, according to ordinary perception, what was happening over the course of those 6 days, not saying that there weren't days before it.
Right.
Where there was other animals that was talking about what they were observing happen right there in front of them over 6 days. So maybe it did happen exactly as it says, but just in that far more localized scope.
Right. I like the temple analogy because in a lot of ways, I see the creation account as the creation of the first temple, and and so I like that analogy, because if you look at the Mesopotamian world, the temple was the place where their idol of their god dwelled. And Genesis is really an apology, in a sense, against that view in many respects, right? Because it's a living temple, it's got a living God that walks in the garden, and so on and so forth. So that, to me, is far a better way to read it than, in any sense, concordance.
I mean, that's actually, I would say,
anyway,
what's surprising, actually, is that that's probably where the majority, I would say, of conservative theologians are currently, which should be encouraging, right? And so there's an opportunity there. You're not as far apart as you might think. That's all I'm trying to say, Louis.
And I guess one way that where we're now speaking differently is who we're talking to. You're talking about conservative theologians. I'm talking about to my audience who are not theologians. Most of them would not be theologians. They're pew warmers, and they do think this way. They do think concordistically. They're not comfortable with the whole mythological treatment of Scripture, and so that's really the people I'm talking to.
Well, I'd say that there's a way to approach this. So if there's a way they'll do it that will provoke a lot of opposition, and there's a way to do it that will have them coming along with you.
Sure.
And it has to do with the revisionist versus the traditionalist approach. If you approach them as a revisionist, saying that there's a new way to do this that most people did not believe, that we just have to change because of science or whatever reason, you're going to get a lot of opposition no matter what you say if you lead it that way. If on the other hand you say, look, let me show you how your understanding of Scripture can be true alongside, and how Christians have actually understood this over the last 2,000 years and how that can actually be true. That's like a traditionalist approach that will have them actually far more amenable to it. I think, I don't know, does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. Okay, we are getting short on time. We promised to have you only for an hour, Josh. But before we have you go, tell us, you also run a website, at least one, the Peaceful Science Group. You've got another book you were talking about, a whole new research direction. So tell us a little bit about the extra things.
There's a Facebook group. There's also a website, peacefulscience.org. If you sign up there, that's great. And, we're small, we're growing. And I think what's been interesting, though, even though we're small and growing, I think it's just had a lot of impact already. So I'm really thankful for that group. Peaceful Science has been a place where there's just been a lot of scholars of different sorts have been gathering to really try and take questions seriously and try and present science in a way that, as trustworthy, scientists. That's what has been really needed. Now, my book is called The Genealogical Adam and Eve. It's on Adam and Eve. And I told you, one of the things that kind of struck me is how important race is to these conversations.
Right.
And that's been what I've been spending a lot of time thinking and writing and speaking about lately, is to think about how we can have better conversations about race, too.
So that's in the works, or it's to the publisher now, or what?
It's in the works. We'll see. Okay. I mean, I'm a full-time scientist, so I have to work hard in my real job, too.
I get it.
So I'm not entirely sure when it'll happen, but, even if it takes a year or two or even a little bit longer to go, I think we'll still probably have need for better conversations and better understanding of race. So I'm not too worried about getting scooped.
Right.
So if I am, and if we make so much progress that my book is unnecessary, that would be even better.
Well, we'll have links in the show notes to your website, to Peaceful Science, and to your book as well. So thanks so much for joining us, Josh. We really appreciated you being on the show. Yeah,
my pleasure. It's a good conversation. I hope we can have a conversation about some other things too soon.
We will on the next book. So thanks again, and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.